Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 5, and we're going to be diving into one of the most complex and important pre-World War II conflict, and that is the Spanish Civil War. Now, I've often looked at this as being a prelude to the Second World War, and it's a very important piece of history that is often overlooked, although it is extremely well represented, it must be said. There's an awful lot of books and written on it, and it also bleeds into modern day and contemporary sources and content, be it songs, poems, stories, all of that sort of thing. It's built up within modern day. It's almost in the language of today, and there's a lot of phrases that are used that actually come from the Spanish Civil War. So now I'll say this up front, I could do a full podcast series just on the causes of the war, and that would still barely reach day one of the actual fighting. It's that dense, there's that amount of content within this war. It's a very complex period. But for today's episode, we're actually going to streamline that down and just give you an introduction over the whole thing and then relate that back to modelling at the end. So first we'll break down how the war actually began and then give it a general overview. That's just to make sense of the madness, really, and try and break down some of the convoluted parts. And then we'll jump into what modelers actually love, and that's the tanks and the aircraft, the different factions, and then the international involvement that made this basically a dry run for the Second World War. And then finally, we'll wrap with some tips, kits, and ideas for modelling in the Spanish Civil War, which I think, honestly, I think is one of the most exciting and underappreciated subjects in the hobby. So let's get into that. So we're going to have the first part here, and that's how the Spanish Civil War began. Now, to understand the Spanish Civil War, you do have to go back quite a long way. Now, some historians would trace the roots maybe as far back as the Middle Ages, but that's a bit too far for us. So we're going to take a key date around, which is 1898. And it's at that point when Spain actually loses the last of its global empire. So Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico are lost because of the Spanish-American War. And then suddenly Spain is gone from being a colonial superpower, and it's more representing itself as a shrinking nation, and it's on the margins of Europe, and it leaves the country feeling a little humiliated, politically fractured, and unsure of its identity. Then comes along the First World War. Now, Spain doesn't actually take part in the First World War as far as the fighting, but it does profit from it quite considerably. Now, the Spanish industry actually supplies arms and ammunition to both sides. So you start getting companies like Hispano-Suiza building engines, guns and gear, which you'll often hear about, or Hispano-Suiza engines and guns being used in many aircraft. And this creates an economic boom. But it only does it in certain regions. So we start to split the country a little bit. There's the industrial north, which is Catalonia, the Basque country, with the Asturias area. This all sees rapid growth. And meanwhile, there's an agrarian south, Andalusia, Extremadura, and these are still stuck in more almost like feudal conditions, and they're dominated by wealthy landowners and a desperately poor peasantry. So now you've got the country split economically, socially, and then slightly by ideology as well. So that then starts to get worse and worse. So if we add to that, there's a monarchy with ties to the Catholic Church and military, and they're quite dominant within the sort of upper elites. There's also a growing working class movement as well, and they're demanding unions, land reform, and they're looking for secular education. And then there's a weak middle class that tends to side with the elite rather than act as a stabilizing force. So they would be professors and people like that are kind of not the upper class, but well off working class. They tend to go slightly more with the actual upper class than dropping down to the working class. So this is starting to create a tricky situation within the country. So this starts to create a sizable amount of unrest. In the 1920s, we see the rise of Primo de Rivera. and he's a military dictator who tries to stabilise things by actually having a successful coup. So this happens in the 20s, he gets into power, but his rule collapses by 1930, and this paves the way for a new government, and that's where the Second Spanish Republic comes, and that's in 1931, and they sweep in, and that also creates the abdication of King Alfonso the 13th. Now, the Republic arrives with quite an ambitious set of reforms, and they intend to break up those large estates that were where the wealthy landowners were to try and help that situation. They want to limit the power of the church and stop it from having so much influence. They also want to cut back the military's influence as well, so that they're starting to break up these bits of power that were all kind of circling around where the king was and causing quite a dominant presence. And they also now want to build a modern secular state. The trouble with this, and this often happens when great sweeping changes come in, they go a bit too fast and they go a bit too hard. Now, conservative Spain is still there, obviously. It's not all about the working classes, and not all about poverty, it's not all about liberal ideas. There's obviously a strong conservative aspect there as well. So conservative Spain, with the military officers, bishops, aristocrats, they push back, and riots break out, strikes escalate, and the army starts to just gently fume in the background. As we talk about the background, there is a quiet but rising officer who starts to... Well, he doesn't really appear at this time, but because of what he does in the future, it's worth mentioning him now. And that's Francisco Franco. Now, he's actually a very much in the background commander of the elite army of Africa, and he is over in Morocco on the continent of Africa. So he's out the way, and he's in charge of Spain's colonial force. Now, he's not a major player yet nationally, but he's starting to see cogs are moving, and he's starting to see a route into perhaps having something slightly better for himself. Now, by 1936, the Second Republic wins another election, and that is a clean win. At that point, the army launches a coup. It fails, but what it also does is tear the country in two. And that is when the Civil War erupts. Now, I've also obviously skipped over quite a lot there, but it gives you the idea. It's basically a broken country split into two different ideals, and that creates problems. Added to that, there's actual political wins for a Republican government, which really upsets the strong conservative side. That is why the second time that happens in 1936, it kicks off like it does. Now, pretty quickly, Spain is divided into the Republicans, and these are defenders of the elected government, and they also are made up of socialists, communists, anarchists, workers, and intellectuals. The Nationals, which are the rebels backed by the army, they're made up mainly of the church, monarchists, fascists, and much of the wealthy class. And that is where we really get to the doorstep of the Civil War. There's a lot of anecdotal stories at this point. There's a lot of things that happen. There are some pretty brutal situations that happen pretty quickly. There are the workers as well that revolt. There's the civil guard that stay with the nationalists. And there's a lot of small political parties as well that make up a large amount of the Republicans as well. That whether there's anarchist parties, there's communist parties, there's socialist parties, all much little smaller groups that are working more as unions and that sort of thing, representing the workers in different groups. They all start to try and get arms, and it gets all very tricky, and you can get situations where brothers are fighting brothers, cousins are fighting cousins, and it does get pretty messy pretty quickly. So it's worth bearing that in mind. There's a number of parts of the Spanish Civil War, and it moves so fast initially that it can be difficult to keep up with, because you'll hear about the International Brigade, you'll hear about some of the more popularised aspects to it, but there are some pretty brutal situations that kick off straight away. And that happens on both sides. It's not just the nationalists or the Republicans. They do it to each other, depending on where these situations happen. Where there's much heavier nationalist areas, they persecute the Republicans very quickly. and vice versa. People are rounded up into bull rings and similar places. A lot of people are executed straight away, or they're tortured, or they're forced to do things that are not very pleasant. And that really is just the state of war. And it is surprising how quickly a non-warring country can turn into a very war-torn country. It's just worth bearing that in mind at this point. We're going to skip over a lot of that because we can't really get into it at this point. But a lot of the material that we talk about later on, books that can be read and sources that can be looked at, they will shine a bit of a heavier light on that, and it is worth sort of bearing that in mind. Okay, so now we'll move into the second part, and that is a very much a Spanish war turning into a global war. Now, the war that started as an internal conflict very quickly becomes a global proxy war. Now, setting the scene, we've got Franco, who we've mentioned earlier. Franco's Army of Africa are the hardened elite troops of the Spanish army, but they're trapped in Morocco. They've risen with the coup, but they're cut off from the Spanish mainland. And it's worth thinking about why they're stuck there. It's well known that there's an airlift, and we'll talk about that. But why are they in Morocco and not able to come across? That's because the Republican Navy controls the seas. So this is quite a dramatic situation here. The Spanish Republican Navy initially joins the coup, but things take quite a sudden and decisive turn because there's a mutiny that breaks out among the enlisted sailors. They overthrow their officer class, which many of whom have nationalist leanings. And now this wasn't just symbolic, it was quite strategic. That bold act retains the majority of the fleet for the Republic, and that's for the entirety of the war. However, they don't really do very much. But what they do is stop Franco coming over straight away on the Navy's fleet. So the sailors immediately attempt to enforce a naval blockade across the Straits of Gibraltar, and this cuts off Franco's forces and it traps them in North Africa. And the Army of Africa, crucial to the nationalist cause, is stuck, at least for this period, this moment in time. This is where the real turning point happens from the Spanish war being a truly Spanish war and turning into a global war in Spain. And that is because foreign attention is alerted to Spain because Franco needs to get his army across the Straits of Gibraltar and get them into the mainland land of Spain. The way he does that is by sending a request for help to both Mussolini and Hitler separately, not at the same time. They both agree for different reasons, and before too long, an awful lot of planes arrive. So Germany and Italy send planes. It's mainly Junkers Ju-52s, but there are some SM-79s and 81s that also help in this. And they actually transport the whole army of Africa from Morocco, and they fly them over to Spain. And that's the first time that there's actually a military airlift in history. So that's a first. It's extremely bold, it's very fast, and it works. Now, this is when Hitler and Mussolini are alerted to what's going on in Spain, and it's part of this 1930s, how Europe was made up, that fascism is quite young at this point, as is communism. They've only been around, I suppose communism, you could argue, has been around longer, but fascism, they're sort of a 1920s development, and they're in full flow in the 1930s as political regimes. So at this point, Spain looks like an opportunity to sell the message of a political regime. And that is why Mussolini and Hitler focus on this quite strongly. Also at this point, there's not a lot else going on. I mean, Mussolini's got eyes on Ethiopia. Obviously, Hitler is deciding to take back parts of Germany, has he, in air quotes. They're not actually in war. So they're up for testing their brand new armies that they've got, and they send quite a lot of stuff over. Italy sends a almost ridiculous amount of equipment, so much so that it directly impacts what they're able to do during the Second World War. Germany isn't so keen, it isn't as silly as that, I would say, from a military point of view. They send a lot of equipment, and as well as having state-of-the-art aircraft, there is also the ground equipment, tanks, trucks, and so on. They're actually transitional types. And actually, when we get into it from a modelling point of view, it's incredibly infuriating, because pretty much everything that goes to Spain that's German is not the standard vehicle that ends up in the Second World War. But we'll get into that later. So they actually send quite a lot of transitional equipment over. So for an example, if we take a SD KFZ 7 half-track, a lot that end up there are more prototypical types, as opposed to what end up going into Russia in 1941. That's more the standard version. So they'll have one less wheel, for instance, or they'll have slightly smaller tyres, and it's all this sort of thing that goes on. So it looks like a lot's being sent, and it is. But from the German point of view, there is that sort of aspect to it that, a lot of it is almost the second line stuff, and they are keeping the best for themselves. Italy, not the case. They're sending the best of what they got. It's quite unusual. Now, when the Army of Africa actually heads over to the Spanish mainland, Franco's forces very quickly push north, and they're heading towards Madrid. And they're sweeping through small towns and villages, and they are killing, pillaging, and much worse. The Republican forces, at this point, are less an army, they're more armed civilians, and they quickly fold under the might of this army in many areas. Now, Franco is very soon on the edge of Madrid. However, the ego takes over, and he makes a detour for a photogenic propaganda stop at a town called Toledo. Now, this had a very little military significance, but it was very easy to make it look good and do a very good propaganda shoot, and it helped propel Franco's notoriety. But it also gives Madrid time to prepare. And more importantly, the Republican government secures arms from the east. And this is the other missing piece. The Soviet Union decide that Spain is also a good advertisement for the communist regime. Stalin decides to back the Republicans. He sends tanks, aircraft, and military advisors. And again, now it must be said, this is quite high-level equipment. Again, it's very good stuff. It's arguably they send over a tank that is the best tank in the world at that point, being the BT-5. So they send tanks, aircraft, and military advisors. But in return, Stalin demands that Spain's gold reserves are sent to Moscow for safekeeping, in air quotes, and that's where they end up. So that sets the scene for the Spanish Civil War to now be a testing ground. Germany tests the Messerschmitt Bf 109, and they have many varying versions of that. So starting with even the prototypes, running through the variants of A, B, D, and then into the E. They also send over a number of bombers as well, which are early variants again of the Heinkel 111, and also Ju-86, the Do-17, Flying Pencil, and the early versions of the Stuka, running through the A to the B1, that is. Italy deploys CR-32 biplanes and early armoured units, as well as bombers. You also get the SM-79 and the SM-81, both excellent planes for the time. The CR-32, as far as biplanes go, is also extremely good. They've got early armoured units, and very much of this time, the only real tank that was around that had a classic gun, as you'd think of it, an anti-tank gun, is the Soviet BT-5 and the T-26. Many of these other tanks are really tankettes or armoured machine gun carriers. So with Italy, you've got the CV-33. They also had flamethrower variants of that. There was a cannon-armed version, but it was a very low caliber. There's also, and then Germany's also got the Panzer I as well. They don't field any other tanks, just the Panzer I, and that's 2 machine guns. And then the Soviets test the T-26 and the BT-5 tanks, along with Polikarpov I-15 biplanes and I-16 monoplanes. So that is what takes to the skies. You also get some bombers as well. There's an even more fascinating aspect to this is the international brigades begin. So these are made up of international volunteers who join the Republican fray. So this is a unit within the Republican Army called the International Brigades, and this brings in communists, idealists, adventurers from the UK, the US, France, Germany, and elsewhere. George Orwell even fights with the POUM militia, which is one of those, as I said earlier, one of those smaller groups that make up the larger Republican side. Hemingway also starts to appear, and he's reporting from Madrid. And you'll find a lot of these big names are on the Republican side. It's like a global fight for good against fascism. That's what everyone is going to Spain for in this respect. It's fighting the good fight against the onslaught of fascism that's creeping up from the middle of Europe, obviously mainly Germany and Italy. Now, as nations, Britain and France, their role in the Spanish War is doing nothing. Now, they sign a non-intervention pact, and this effectively leaves Spain to burn. Now, in truth, Britain actually fears a leftist Spain more than a fascist one. So any big aid being sent over to help bolster the legally voted in Republican government, from Britain's point of view, at this point in the global scale, that's a bad thing. So they're happy to just let this carry on as it is, because odds on at this point it looks like it's very much going to be a nationalist win, and they don't want this to be a stepping stone to a larger European war. And I mean, with hindsight, they're not doing anything helped make this turn into a European war. Now, France initially agreed to aid the Republican government, but as soon as pressure's put on by Britain, who's very much a close ally at that point and very much a leader, as soon as they put pressure on France to stop, France stops. So they close the borders, and that's it. So there's a little bit of back and forth early on in 1936 between France and Spain, especially as they share a border, but that's very quickly closed. Things generally go one way then. You can flee Spain into France, but not much from France goes into Spain. So only Germany and Italy also sign this non-aggression pact. So it's the four of them, but they imagine that everyone's just going to do it anyway. But Britain and France don't. So Germany break the rules, and they actually reshape Spain in the process. So by late 1936, the Spanish Civil War is now no longer just Spain's war. It's become it's become a prelude to the Second World War, and it's actually a battleground where a lot of the ideologies, weapons and tactics of the future global conflict begin to be tested. Now, the war moves quite relentlessly through 1937. Battles rage both in the air and on the ground, and while there are some Republican victories, the momentum is very much with the nationalists. Franco's forces benefit from the better coordination, more consistent foreign support, and actually a growing sense of inevitability as well. There are powerful moments of resistance that actually live long in history and are still relevant to today. And perhaps the most famous is Madrid. The actual capital holds out far longer than anyone expects, right the way through until 1939. And it becomes an international symbol of defiance. And that is defined by the iconic slogan of "No pasarán," meaning they shall not pass. And this was a banner draped across the streets of Madrid. Now, in that same year, in April 1937, the world is actually shocked. This does go out and it has ripples, by the bombing of Guernica, which is a very well-known event. This is a coordinated attack by German and Italian aircraft, and it devastates the civilian population, and then is later immortalised by Picasso's painting. And it's one of the first times strategic bombing is actually used on a civilian target, and it's a very grim foreshadowing of things to come in the Second World War. Now, in the rugged northern mountain areas, the front settles down into trench warfare and stalemate. It's mud, blood and artillery echoing the First World War. In 1938, the Republicans launch a last major push, and this is the Ebro offensive, and it's quite an ambitious, if not desperate, and massive push to try and break through the nationalist lines. But ultimately it fails, and that failure really seals the fate of the Republic. It's the last push. They've not got much left after that. By spring 1939, Madrid falls. The Republican government collapses, and its leaders, as well as thousands of civilians, flee over the Pyrenees into France, seeking safety. Many would never actually return to Spain. Franco claims victory of Spain, and he doesn't let go. His authoritarian regime rules Spain with quite a heavy hand, right up until his death in 1975. There is a number of things that happen at the end which are curious in many ways. All of the war material that is sent over from both the Republican Soviets on the Republican side and the Italian and German side is left in Spain, and there is a very small window where Spain has an extremely large air force and army and ground force. Of course, a lot of the Soviet equipment is captured and used, and it's repainted with the Spanish flag, red, yellow, red, around the turret, and that is used and then retained. So there's an awful lot of T-26s, BT-5s, Panzer Is, tankettes from the Italian side, as well as state-of-the-art aircraft, be it at this point very many Emil, so 109Es of the Messerschmitt. There's even a few Fiat G50s that get there, and the early guys that actually have an enclosed canopy. There's all the bombers. There's a number of Heinkels and Dorniers and Stukas, all of which mainly stay there. Very quickly, Germany, Hitler and Mussolini just move on from Spain. They don't do anything about it. They leave it all there. There is a couple of visits. There is a visit from Hitler in Spain during the Second World War that doesn't go very well at all. And Franco tends to get away without having to give very much. There's a little bit of supply during the Second World War of materials such as coal and metals and things like that they've got. As is with Italy, but very quickly, as soon as the tide changes in the Second World War, Franco sees this, doesn't fall in so hard on the fascist thing at that point, and he tends to tidy up, at least outgoingly, make it look like Spain is a little bit more, how shall I put it, not quite as heavy on the right, the fascism. He sort of rolls it back a little bit, so the outward global view is that he's coming in a little bit more as he starts to know that Britain and the USA are going to win the Second World War. He very much goes in with that side. A lot of these aircraft are maintained in the Spanish Air Force. They are re-engined, so as Germany falls and the Second World War ends, engines become very scarce. So Franco's got an entire fleet of aircraft that are engined with German engines that now no longer exist. An awful lot of them are actually re-engined with Merlin engines, so the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that's in the Spitfire, and they become license built as well, so they're like Hispano-Suiza engines, and that makes all sorts of different types of aircraft, these sort of hybrids. So the 109 becomes the Bucon, and there's even colour photos of 109 rears with Spitfire fronts, essentially, carrying rockets. It's quite a strange look in the 50s. And the Heinkels are re-engined as well. And these are seen in a more modern source during the Battle of Britain. So, Battle of Britain film. And a lot of the aircraft used in that are the Spanish Heinkels and the Spanish 109s. So that's the overview of how this war actually unfolds and ends. So now let's have a look at the actual modelling side of this period. So from the scale modelling aspect, the Spanish Civil War is a rich subject. It's huge from a modelling perspective. It's historically rich, a little chaotic, and it's absolutely packed with unusual subjects. The majority of attention naturally goes to aircraft, and that's for good reason, because there was over 300 different types used during the war. And that number alone just shows you how desperate both sides were, especially the Republicans, who were scrambling to get their hands on anything that could fly. Now, we know about the big Soviet types like the Polikarpov I-15 or the I-16 and the SB-2 bomber, all sent from the USSR. But beyond those, there were dozens of lesser-known even borderline bizarre aircraft pressed into combat. So this is everything from civilian conversions to procured second-hand machines. For example, Bristol Bulldogs came in via Estonia, and at least from Estonia, and at least one made it to Spain. It's almost certain there was more like 5. But for years, this was rumoured that the Bristol Bulldog was used in the north. But a few years ago, a picture emerged on eBay that actually showed one of these fuselages being loaded onto a truck and being taken to scrap after the Northern Battle, so it was very much there. You've also got Beechcraft Stagger Wings, de Havilland DH-60s, Foxmoths, Pussmoths, all pressed into service. Some were used as liaison aircraft, but others were actually retrofitted for bombing. There was even a makeshift bomber group, and this was flying things like the Fokker F7 and the Dragon Rapides, and these were literally throwing bombs out of the side doors in flight. And it's not just what was flown, it's actually who used it as well. One fascinating pattern in this war is how Republican planes, once lost or crash landed, were often repaired and reused by the nationalists. With a quick repaint, camouflage touch-ups, that suddenly it was flying under new colours. And then even the other way around, an actual 109, a very early B or A 109 gets captured by the Republicans. That gets then sent to Russia for testing. And then during the invasion of Russia, it's then recaptured by the German forces. It's some of this stuff you just can't write. Now, aircraft modelling challenges. There is a slight problem with this. It's not generally easy, and I've found that it's quite different. It's very easy to get bogged down in every kit being hard work, certainly on the aircraft. But that is a lot of fun as well, and it does mean that a lot of what the subjects you make become extremely unique. So there's a lot of kits that don't exist, but if they do, they are usually these short-run resin or vac form kits, even till today. You'll often find that what seems like a simple kit, like a Stuka, isn't quite right. For example, Spain saw only the Ju-87A and the B1 variants, which are very different from the more common B2 kits that you usually find. So you don't just get a Stuka B, it needs to be a B1, and the B2 is the one that was used more generally during the Second World War. Now, Airfix, to my knowledge, are the only one that have a B1 in 1/48 scale, and I believe there isn't actually even a B1 in 1/72 scale. There's a lot of Stuka Bs, but they're actually B2s. There's a slight difference around the cowling. Easy to convert once you know, but it's very easy to make something you think is right and it turn out to be wrong. And this goes for the Messerschmitt Bf109 as well. The Condor Legion fielded prototypes and early variants. So you get the V series. There's only a few of them, like V4 and a few others. There's the A series as well and the B series. And these all have subtle but important differences. And then there's the C variant. Now this is often reported to be in Spain, but it almost certainly never actually deployed because it's got quite a complex fuel system and different parts, and it just would not make sense to send the C mixed in with all these other aircraft that has all with this different issue. So it's almost certain that the Cs stayed in Germany, but there is a number of aircraft that are documented as a 109C, but I don't personally believe that's the case. So, as I've mentioned before, Airfix finally released a proper B1 Stuka. That's both in 1/72 and later with 1/48. And this is it was quite a huge deal for me at the time because it had the right nose and intake and the cowling. Now, the Heinkel 111, again, Spain used the early B, C and E variants, and these have an actual windshield, not the usual glass frontage greenhouse that with the Second World War types. So they're a problem. Now, Roden make that kit in all variants, but it is just so hard to build. It's difficult to get that across in words. You need to get the kit, try and put it together, and then you'll realise just quite how difficult that is. There's other oddities as well. So the DO-17 Flying Pencil, again, they're early versions. They're not widely made. I don't think there's any in 1/48 scale. Oh, there's a couple, the Hobbycraft ones, the very old Hobbycraft ones. There's the Ju-86 as well, which is, again, another unusual aircraft, and we've only got the old Italieri kit, really. And then there's Henschels as well. So you've got the Henschel 123, which is a dive bomber. We do have very good versions of that. We've got Gas Patch in 1/48th. We've got now a brand new release from ICM in 1/32nd. So they're very good. Ground vehicles. Now, a unique landscape is the actual state of the tanks that were used. And I use that term, again, in air quotes, because what makes a tank? Well, for this, if it's fielded as a tank, we'll put it like that. So Spain actually had quite a lot of First World War tanks left over. They had numerous FT-17s and a few Schneider CA-1s. And these were all deployed in the war right at the beginning, mainly by these small groups that make up the Republican side, these small political groups. It was that arm the workers, and they would get hold of these tanks and run them out, and, you know, they did a little bit here and there. What was the most iconic thing that was made at this time is they actually turned armoured trucks into kind of mobile... I don't know how you describe it. They're so unusual and unique. Every single one is literally unique. They would use one-off vehicles. So they'd get buses, delivery vans and lorries, and they'd armour them in all kinds of weird shapes as well. Some of them look like massive shoes. You know, they've got the sort of shape of a shoe. It's all curved at the front. Very unusual. Chains hanging down around the bottom as well, so that you can't shoot at the tyres. And then guys would get in. Some of them would have turrets on the top, but guys would get in and put guns out the side. It makes you wonder what they look like. But these are all fielded and all used. Now, almost none of these are actually available as a standard kit form. A lot of them do appear in wargaming, so you'll get them in strange scales like 1/56th. As well as 1/72nd, but there's not many in 1/35th scale. You'd have to actually scratch build them. Then there's actually the proper tanks. So we've got Soviet T-26s and BT-5s, which are really the only proper tank that's fielded in this war. And then very quickly they were lost to the nationalists. So you've got both fielding them in the Republican guise, which is mainly just green with small numbers or slogans written on them. And then as soon as they're captured by the nationalists, the turrets were painted either completely around or in sections with red, yellow, red banding. You will often see Republican tanks in books and pictures, not real photos, but actually coloured photos and stuff with red, yellow, purple around the top of the turret, which is the Republican flag. It's almost certain that that was not ever used, and it's a myth. It's or whenever you see that depicted as being Republican, it's just misinterpreted nationalist colours. Then the Germans contributed the Panzer 1A and B. Now, both were machine gun only, but B has an extra wheel and a slightly different suspension. It's also got a raised idler off the back, so you can tell them apart. The A has 4 wheels, and then the idler touches the ground at the back, and the B has 5 wheels, then a raised idler at the back. The Italians sent over CV-33 and 35 tankettes with machine guns, flamethrowers, and light gun. You do get an oddity as well. You get the Breda Panzer 1, which is an upgunned version with the Breda autocannon. So a slightly different mantlet and a little section built on the top of the turret as well. But there was only sort of 4 or 5 of those made. They're Spanish conversions. And you get a healthy mix of logistical and support vehicles as well, with Opel Blitz trucks, the early SDKFZ-7 half-tracks, ZIS Soviet trucks, and these are all excellent modelling subjects and widely available. You just got to check your variants, but Hobby Boss do the ZIS truck. There is a Dragon version of the SDKFZ-7, which is correct, and the Opel Blitz, I'm not certain, was massively different, but there's enough versions of that around now as well, with Miniart and the Tamiya one. It's pretty simple to convert them over, and again, depending on where you're sharing them, most people won't know they're different. Now, it's worth talking about the communities, resources, and building inspiration. So I've personally done a lot of Spanish Civil War builds over the years, and I've started the Spanish Civil War modelling group on Facebook, which now has over 7,000 members. Now, that is a great space full of helpful builders and historical experts, and many of them are based in Spain, and that is the main... Very much you'll find out if something's real or not by putting it in there, and they'll soon sort you out if there's a myth or not, but all very friendly, and I'm always keeping an eye on it so we don't let it get carried away in there. There's also the Spanish Civil War Special Interest Group, which is an IPMS SIG in the UK, which I also run. And it's got a companion site as well at scwsig.wordpress.com. That's not the website domain I choose, but it's what I was given for free. Now, between that, YouTube builds and forum communities, there's a lot of support if you're actually interested in diving into this era. What I love about this period is that it's a modeller's playground. You could make it a life's mission to build every aircraft used, and you'd never finish. But you can also just pick one subject and really go deep. And either way, there's a huge creative potential. Weathering is an especially big opportunity because everything in this conflict was absolutely plastered in dust. So if you're into dioramas, you've got a mini Stalingrad in Madrid, you've got trench warfare in the north, and you've got huge combined arms battles like the Ebro. So if you want unusual and you want a challenge and you want historical depth, this era is a treasure trove. That's why I keep promoting it. Now, it's worth talking about the further reading as well, because the Spanish Civil War is more than just an historical curiosity. It's a dress rehearsal for the Second World War, both from the ideology point of view and militarily. It's also a fantastic space for scale modelling as well. So if you're trying to want to find something off the beaten path or practice pre-war weathering and build subjects for the real world or alternate history overlap. So it's worth talking about some books you can have a look at that are going to be very helpful. So if you want to learn a bit more, here's some good and very good resources. So about the actual war, The Battle for Spain by Anthony Beevor is probably the best single volume history of the war from an accessibility point of view. It's written in a way that you can get through it, whereas others are written, they can be a bit tricky at the start, put it like that. So we've also got Homage to Catalonia, which is George Orwell. Now these are more, they're good for the setting. They're not necessarily military history. They got an aspect of storytelling to them. So that's Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell and For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. Two very well-known books, but both about the Spanish Civil War. There's also, if you want the heavy, dense military history of the war, that would be The Battle for Spain by Anthony Beevor. And if you want to know absolutely everything relating to the Spanish Civil War, then there's no better than Paul Preston. That is full-on history, but it can be a bit heavy. You've got to be really into it to do that. Something I would suggest, it's a very good book, just to get an overview, is one of the very short introduction books from the Oxford Press, which is The Spanish Civil War by Helen Graham. That's very easy to digest, and it's all done. I have it in hand. Let me have a look. We're all done in about 150 pages, and that is extremely accessible. It's pretty much a very quick overview on every aspect. There's a number of Osprey books as well on the international brigades, or Tanks in Spain by Steve Zaloga. That's brilliant. A fantastic book for German military vehicles used is one made by Frontline Books, which is literally called German Military Vehicles in the Spanish Civil War, and it's a comprehensive study of the development of German military vehicles on the eve of World War II. That book has pictures in it that I'd never seen anywhere. For aircraft, specifically on the Bf-109, there is absolutely no better book than German Eagles in Spanish Skies, published by Schiffer and written by David Johnson. That is an absolute fantastic book, and it's pretty much the only thing you need for the 109 in Spain. There's also a number of books relating to German aircraft and also general aircraft as well. Some of them are much older and harder to get hold of, but they're well worth looking out for. And then you can usually find aspects of the Spanish Civil War in general books about the aircraft. So usually if you get a book about the Stuka or the Henschel 123 or the 109, they've often got a section about their use during the Spanish Civil War. Now, I would like to just sort of give a spotlight on a few aspects of the war that are just, these things come out of it time and time again. So these are little anecdotes that happened. So as a quick spotlight for people that like the naval side, there was quite a heavy presence of Italian submarines and German naval vessels, and notably the Graf Spee, the pocket battleship, passed through Spanish waters on a number of times patrolling. it was briefly fired upon by the Republican troops on the mainland, and Hitler was so enraged when hearing about this that he had to be talked down from declaring war on the Republic. There's also another incident. So during the siege of Santuario de Nuestra Senora de la Cabeza, or the Basilica and Royal Sanctuary of Our Lady of the Head, in late 1936, nationalist planes dropped supplies to besieged civil guards, and to avoid damaging delicate supplies, they attached them to live turkeys, which fluttered down and acted as makeshift parachutes and also became a source of fresh meat. It's worth talking about how it has bled into culture as well a little bit. So there's famous songs, the Manic Street Preachers, If You Tolerate This, Then Your Children Will Be Next. That is the whole song is about the Spanish Civil War, and it is a direct quote from a poster used in Spain, which was highlighting the bombing of Madrid. It was a poster used in Madrid. There's also a tiny... whether this is true or not, it's just worth mentioning it. There is a famous little story that almost... how would you know it happened? But in April 1937, Guernica was bombed. As we know, civilians were at market day and the scenes were extremely brutal. Now, Picasso was living... Picasso then immortalised that in his painting of Guernica. And this is the thing that I don't think is true, but I think is worth throwing in there, is Picasso was living in Nazi-occupied Paris when a German officer saw a photo of Guernica in his flat, and the officer asked, "Did you do that?" And Picasso replied, "No, you did." It's a nice little touch. I don't know how that could be possibly true, because I don't know who would be able to interpret it. How can you? But it's a nice touch, isn't it? So I think that about wraps it up. That's a little brief look at the conflict and war in Spain, and it highlights why I think it's, from a modelling point of view, it's a very interesting subject, but more importantly, from a historical point of view, it shouldn't be overlooked. It shows the war is incredibly relevant even today, and it is worth taking some time just to understand what happened on the war and what it was all about. So hopefully this podcast episode has helped with that a little bit, and let me know your thoughts if it has. So please do, if you haven't already, give us a review on wherever you download your podcast from. Leave a comment if you're on YouTube, or able to do that on Apple Podcasts and all the rest of it. And as always, thanks for listening. I'll be back in the next episode.